Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. It's always intriguing to see how far these accounts travel and when they find their audience. With that said, let's journey back into the past. In the autumn of 1913, deep within the rolling hills of the Missouri Ozarks, something impossible was happening. In a small cabin surrounded by dense oak and hickory forests, a 13-year-old girl named Clara Smith lay dying from an illness that would baffle doctors, terrify neighbors, and challenge everything the medical world thought it knew about the human body. What began as a simple fever would spiral into one of the most chilling medical mysteries in American history. Clara's case would draw physicians from as far as Chicago, journalists from major newspapers, and curious onlookers from across the Midwest. Yet despite all the attention, all the examinations, and all the desperate attempts to save her, Clara Smith would become known as the girl science couldn't explain. The story you're about to hear is not fiction. It's documented in medical journals, newspaper archives, and the handwritten notes of bewildered doctors who witnessed phenomena that shouldn't exist. It's a tale that sits uncomfortably at the intersection of science and superstition, reason and the inexplicable. And more than a century later, Clara Smith's case remains as mysterious today as it was in that fateful autumn of 1913. To understand Clara's story, we must first journey back to a time when America was caught between two worlds. The year 1913 marked a fascinating crossroads in history. While Henry Ford's assembly lines were revolutionizing industry in Detroit, and the first skyscrapers were rising in New York City, vast portions of rural America remained virtually unchanged from the previous century. The Missouri Ozarks in 1913 were a place where time seemed to move differently. These ancient mountains, worn smooth by millions of years of wind and rain, harbored communities that had remained isolated for generations. Here, families like the Smiths lived much as their great-grandparents had, farming small plots of rocky soil, hunting in the deep forests, and relying on traditions passed down through oral history. The nearest town to the Smith homestead was barely more than a crossroads with a general store, a church, and perhaps 24 homes scattered along dirt roads that became impassable rivers of mud during the frequent rains. The nearest railroad was 40 miles away over treacherous mountain paths. The nearest hospital was even farther, and for most Ozark families, it might as well have been on the moon. In this isolated world, folk medicine reigned supreme. When someone fell ill, the community turned first to the local healer, usually an elderly woman who knew which roots could break a fever, which herbs could ease pain, and which rituals might drive away the more mysterious ailments that occasionally plagued the mountain people. These healers had been practicing their craft since before the Civil War, and their knowledge, though unscientific by modern standards, had kept Ozark communities alive for generations. Religion, too, played a central role in daily life. The Smith family, like most of their neighbors, were devout Baptists who attended the small wooden church that served their corner of the mountains. They believed in the power of prayer, the reality of miracles, and the existence of forces both divine and diabolic that could intervene in human affairs. This wasn't mere superstition to them. It was lived experience, as real as the changing seasons or the morning mist that clung to the valleys. Into this world, science was just beginning to intrude. Traveling doctors occasionally made their way into the Ozarks, bringing with them newfangled ideas about germs and modern medicines. But these outsiders were often viewed with suspicion. Their expensive educations and fancy instruments seemed less trustworthy than the time-tested wisdom of the local healers who had been keeping Ozark families healthy for decades. It was in this complex cultural landscape that the Smith family had made their home. Thomas Smith was a man typical of his time and place, a farmer and occasional hunter who worked dawn to dusk to scratch a living from the unforgiving Ozark soil. His wife, Mary, tended their small cabin, raised their children, and supplemented the family's meager income by taking in sewing from neighbors. They were respected members of their community, known for their honesty, their strong work ethic, and their devotion to their faith. The Smiths had 5 children, but it was their youngest daughter, Clara, who would forever change their lives and challenge everything the world thought it knew about medicine and human nature. Even as a small child, Clara had been different from her siblings. Where her brothers and sisters were robust and healthy, Clara was delicate, almost ethereal. She was smaller than other children her age, with pale skin that seemed almost translucent and large, dark eyes that seemed to see more than they should. Clara's intelligence was remarkable, even by the standards of adults who knew her. Despite having only sporadic access to formal education, she could read and write with a sophistication that amazed visitors to the Smith cabin. She had an uncanny ability to predict weather changes days in advance, and neighbors often remarked that she seemed to know things she couldn't possibly know. When someone was about to fall ill, when travelers were approaching the valley, when trouble was brewing in families miles away. Her mother, Mary, often worried about Clara's unusual gifts. In the deeply religious Ozark community, such abilities could be seen as either blessed or cursed, depending on the circumstances. Mary prayed regularly that God would protect her strange, wonderful daughter from whatever forces seemed to surround her. Clara's childhood was marked by episodes that, in retrospect, seemed to foreshadow the terrible events of 1913. She suffered from what the family called spells, brief periods when she would become distant and dreamy, speaking of things and places she had never seen. During these episodes, her voice would change, taking on different accents and inflections that seemed to belong to other people entirely. The local preacher, Reverend Samuel Morrison, took a special interest in Clara. He believed she possessed what he called the sight, a spiritual gift that allowed her to perceive truths hidden from ordinary people. He often invited her to join him in prayer sessions, marveling at her ability to quote scripture she had never studied, and to offer insights that seemed far beyond her years. But not everyone in the community viewed Clara's abilities with such benevolence. Some of the older residents, particularly those who remembered the darker aspects of Ozark folklore, whispered that the Smith girl was touched, marked by forces that were better left undisturbed. They pointed to the fact that animals behaved strangely around her, that plants seemed to wither or flourish unnaturally in her presence, and that she sometimes spoke of conversations with people who had been dead for years. These whispers remained just that, whispers, until the autumn of 1913, when Clara's unusual gifts would transform into something far more sinister and inexplicable. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on a crisp October morning. Clara had been helping her mother with the morning chores when she suddenly collapsed, her small body convulsing violently on the wooden floor of their cabin. Mary Smith's screams brought her husband running from the fields, and together they watched in horror as their daughter writhed in what appeared to be the grip of an invisible tormentor. The seizure lasted nearly an hour, far longer than any epileptic fit the family had ever witnessed. When it finally ended, Clara lay unconscious for the rest of the day, her breathing so shallow that Mary repeatedly held a mirror to her daughter's lips to confirm she was still alive. When Clara finally awakened, she seemed changed. Her voice was different, deeper, more mature, with traces of accents that seemed to come from nowhere. She complained of terrible headaches and claimed she could see things that weren't there. Most disturbing of all, she began to speak of events happening in distant places with an accuracy that would later be confirmed by travelers and letters. Thomas Smith, a practical man who had little patience for what he considered supernatural nonsense, was determined to find a rational explanation for his daughter's condition. He hitched up his wagon and made the treacherous journey to the county seat, where he consulted with Dr. James Henderson, the only formally trained physician within 50 miles of their home. Dr. Henderson was a man caught between two worlds. Educated at a prestigious medical college in St. Louis, he had come to the Ozarks with modern ideas about medicine and healing. But years of practicing in the mountains had taught him to respect the limitations of his knowledge and the complexity of the human body. He had seen too many cases that defied his medical training to dismiss anything as impossible. When Dr. Henderson first examined Clara, he was struck by several unusual observations. Her temperature fluctuated wildly throughout the day, sometimes rising to levels that should have been fatal, then dropping to near hypothermic readings within hours. Her pulse was equally erratic, sometimes racing so fast it was difficult to count, other times slowing to rates that barely sustained life. Most puzzling of all were Clara's neurological symptoms. During her episodes, she would lose consciousness but continue to speak, often in languages that Dr. Henderson couldn't identify. She would describe places she had never visited in perfect detail, carry on conversations with invisible participants, and demonstrate knowledge of subjects far beyond her education or experience. Dr. Henderson's initial diagnosis was epilepsy, but Clara's symptoms didn't fit the typical patterns he had learned in medical school. Her seizures were too varied, too complex, and too intertwined with apparent moments of supernatural insight. He prescribed the standard treatments of the era: bromide salts to calm her nervous system, cold baths to reduce her fevers, and complete bed rest. Nothing worked. If anything, Clara's condition seemed to worsen under medical treatment. Her episodes became more frequent and more intense. She began to experience what could only be described as out-of-body experiences, describing events happening miles away with shocking accuracy. She would speak of conversations taking place in the county courthouse, describe the contents of letters that hadn't yet been delivered, and predict weather patterns with an accuracy that amazed even the most experienced Ozark weather watchers. Word of Clara's strange illness began to spread throughout the mountain communities. In a region where news traveled slowly and gossip was the primary form of entertainment, the story of the Smith girl, who could see things that hadn't happened yet, became the topic of conversation in every cabin and crossroads store. The local folk healer, an elderly Cherokee woman known only as Grandmother Willow, was the first to suggest that Clara's illness might be supernatural in origin. Grandmother Willow had been practicing traditional medicine in the Ozarks for more than 60 years, and she claimed to have seen similar cases in her youth. According to her, Clara was suffering from what her people called spirit sickness, a condition that occurred when the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds became thin, allowing entities from the other side to influence or possess the living. Mary Smith, desperate to help her daughter and frustrated by the failure of conventional medicine, invited Grandmother Willow to examine Clara. The old healer's assessment was both fascinating and terrifying. She claimed that Clara's spirit was loose, partially separated from her physical body and drifting between different planes of existence. This explained her ability to see distant events and speak with the voices of others. But it also meant she was in constant danger of being permanently separated from her earthly form. Grandmother Willow's treatment involved a complex series of rituals designed to strengthen Clara's connection to her physical body and protect her from malevolent spirits that might be trying to claim her. These ceremonies, conducted over several nights in the Smith cabin, combined Cherokee spiritual practices with elements borrowed from European folk magic and Christian prayer. For a brief time, it seemed the treatments might be working. Clara's seizures became less frequent, and she appeared more lucid during her waking hours. But just as the family began to hope for recovery, Clara's condition took a turn that would defy every attempt at rational explanation. It began with the voices. During her episodes, Clara had always spoken in different accents and inflections. But now, she began to hold detailed conversations with invisible participants. These weren't the rambling, incoherent utterances typical of delirium. They were clear, logical discussions that seemed to be taking place with specific individuals. Dr. Henderson, who had been monitoring Clara's condition closely, was present during one of these conversations. He later wrote in his medical notes that Clara appeared to be speaking with a deceased member of her family, discussing family history and events that had occurred before Clara's birth. The accuracy of the historical details was verified by older family members, but there was no way Clara could have known such specific information. Even more disturbing were Clara's apparent conversations with living people in distant locations. On one occasion, she seemed to be speaking with her uncle, who lived more than 100 miles away. She discussed his recent illness and his plans to visit the family for Christmas. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from the uncle, confirming both his illness and his travel plans, information he had not shared with anyone before Clara's conversation with him. The medical establishment of 1913 had no framework for understanding such phenomena. Dr. Henderson consulted with colleagues in St. Louis and Chicago, sharing his detailed notes and asking for advice. The responses he received ranged from suggestions of hysteria and malingering to recommendations for more drastic treatments like hydrotherapy and electrical shock therapy. But Dr. Henderson had been present during too many of Clara's episodes to dismiss her condition as mere hysteria. He had witnessed phenomena that challenged everything he had learned about medicine and human physiology. In his private journals, he began to wonder whether science might be approaching the limits of its ability to explain the mysteries of human consciousness. Meanwhile, the Smith family found themselves at the center of growing attention from the outside world. Word of Clara's unusual case had reached newspaper editors in Springfield and St. Louis, and reporters began making the difficult journey to the remote Ozark cabin. These journalists came expecting to find a case of rural superstition and medical ignorance, but many left as believers in phenomena they couldn't explain. The first major newspaper article about Clara appeared in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in November 1913. Written by veteran reporter William Patterson, the article described Clara as a living mystery that challenges our understanding of the possible. Patterson had spent 3 days with the Smith family, witnessing several of Clara's episodes firsthand. His detailed account of her seemingly supernatural abilities created a sensation throughout the Midwest. Other newspapers quickly picked up the story. The Chicago Tribune sent a team of reporters and photographers to document Clara's case. The Kansas City Star commissioned a series of articles exploring the intersection of medicine and the supernatural. Within weeks, Clara Smith had become a household name throughout much of the central United States. The attention brought both opportunities and problems for the Smith family. Wealthy benefactors offered to pay for Clara's treatment at the finest hospitals in the country. Scientists and physicians requested permission to study her case. Religious leaders wanted to examine her for signs of divine intervention or demonic possession. But the constant stream of visitors also disrupted the family's quiet mountain life and may have worsened Clara's condition. The stress of being constantly observed and examined seemed to trigger more frequent episodes, and Clara began to withdraw into herself during her lucid moments, speaking less and showing signs of profound sadness. It was during this period of intense scrutiny that Clara began to display what can only be described as miraculous abilities. Witnesses reported that she could survive for weeks without eating solid food, sustaining herself apparently on nothing but water and occasional sips of milk. Medical observers confirmed that she lost no weight during these fasting periods and showed no signs of malnutrition. Even more remarkable were reports that Clara could somehow survive without sleep for days at a time. She would lie in her bed with her eyes closed, but observers noted that her brain seemed to remain active. During these periods, she would continue her conversations with invisible participants, often providing running commentary on events happening in distant locations. Dr. Henderson, who had become something of a believer in Clara's supernatural abilities, began to document these phenomena with scientific rigor. He maintained detailed charts of her vital signs, recorded her conversations, and attempted to verify her claims about distant events. His notes from this period read like a cross between a medical journal and a supernatural investigation. The scientific community's response to Dr. Henderson's reports was predictably skeptical. Colleagues accused him of being deceived by clever trickery or of allowing his objectivity to be compromised by prolonged exposure to rural superstition. But Dr. Henderson stood by his observations, insisting that he had witnessed phenomena that could not be explained by conventional medicine. As winter settled over the Ozarks, Clara's condition continued to deteriorate. Her episodes became more frequent and more intense, sometimes lasting for days at a time. During these prolonged states, she would speak almost continuously, carrying on complex conversations with what appeared to be dozens of different invisible participants. Some of these conversations were with deceased family members and friends, discussing events from the past with startling accuracy. Others seemed to be with living people in distant locations, providing information that was later confirmed by telegraph and letter. Most disturbing of all were her apparent conversations with entities that seemed to exist outside normal human experience entirely. These beings, if they could be called that, spoke through Clara in languages that no one could identify. They discussed concepts and ideas that seemed beyond human understanding, describing realms of existence that bore no resemblance to the physical world. Dr. Henderson attempted to record these conversations, but the strange languages defied transcription, and Clara herself claimed no memory of these episodes when they ended. Religious leaders from across the region came to examine Clara, seeking to determine whether her condition was divine, demonic, or simply medical in nature. The local Baptist preacher, Reverend Morrison, maintained that Clara was blessed with genuine spiritual gifts, but visiting clergy from other denominations were less certain, with some suggesting that her condition might be the result of demonic influence. A Catholic priest from St. Louis, Father Michael O'Brien, spent several days observing Clara and concluded that she was suffering from a form of spiritual possession. He offered to perform an exorcism, but the Smith family, after much prayer and consideration, declined. They feared that such a dramatic intervention might harm their daughter more than help her. Folk healers and spiritual practitioners from throughout the Ozarks also came to examine Clara. Their diagnoses varied widely, from Cherokee spirit sickness to European witchcraft to African American hoodoo influences. Some offered treatments ranging from herbal remedies to complex spiritual rituals, but none seemed to provide lasting relief. As fame spread, she began to attract visitors from even farther afield. Old spiritualists from New York and California made the journey to the remote Ozark cabin, convinced that Clara represented proof of their beliefs about communication with the spirit world. Theosophists saw her as evidence of human consciousness's ability to transcend physical limitations. Even early parapsychologists began to take interest in her case. But perhaps the most significant visitor was Dr. Margaret Hessler, one of the few female physicians practicing in the Midwest in 1913. Dr. Hessler had studied neurology at Johns Hopkins and specialized in treating patients with unusual neurological conditions. She came to the Ozarks with a team of medical equipment, determined to find a scientific explanation for Clara's symptoms. Dr. Hessler's examination of Clara was the most thorough medical evaluation the girl had received. Using the most advanced diagnostic tools available in 1913, she conducted extensive tests of Clara's nervous system, brain function, and overall physiology. Her findings were both fascinating and disturbing. Clara's brain activity, as measured by primitive electroencephalographic equipment, showed patterns unlike anything Dr. Hessler had ever seen. During her episodes, her brain seemed to be operating at levels of activity that should have been incompatible with consciousness, yet she remained aware and responsive throughout. Her neurological reflexes were also highly unusual, sometimes appearing completely normal, and other times showing responses that suggested damage to parts of her brain that appeared perfectly healthy. Most puzzling of all were Clara's vital signs during her episodes. Her heart rate, blood pressure, and respiration would fluctuate wildly, sometimes reaching levels that should have resulted in immediate cardiac arrest or respiratory failure. Yet Clara not only survived these extreme physiological states, but seemed unaffected by them once the episodes ended. Dr. Hessler's preliminary diagnosis was that Clara was suffering from a previously unknown neurological condition that affected her consciousness in ways that medical science didn't yet understand. She recommended that Clara be transferred to a major medical center for more extensive study. But the Smith family, exhausted by months of examinations and treatments, refused to allow their daughter to be moved. As winter deepened into spring, Clara's condition began to change in new and alarming ways. Her episodes became less frequent but more intense, sometimes lasting for entire weeks. During these prolonged states, she would exist in what could only be described as a trance-like condition, neither fully conscious nor completely unconscious. Witnesses during this period reported phenomena that stretched the boundaries of belief. Clara would sometimes levitate several inches above her bed, remaining suspended in midair for hours at a time. Objects in her room would move without apparent cause, and strange lights would appear around her body during her deepest trances. Temperature readings in Clara's room fluctuated wildly, sometimes dropping to near freezing levels even during warm spring days. Visitors reported feeling overwhelming sensations of sadness, fear, or euphoria when entering the room, as if Clara's emotional state was somehow affecting the environment around her. Dr. Henderson, who had been documenting Clara's case from the beginning, found himself struggling to maintain his scientific objectivity in the face of phenomena that seemed to violate the basic laws of physics. His medical notes from this period show a man wrestling with the possibility that human consciousness might be capable of effects that science had never imagined. Religious observers interpreted these new phenomena in various ways. Some saw them as evidence of divine intervention, signs that Clara had been chosen for a special spiritual purpose. Others viewed them as confirmation of demonic influence, proof that malevolent forces were using the girl as a conduit between the spiritual and physical worlds. The Smith family, caught in the middle of these conflicting interpretations, struggled to care for their daughter while dealing with the constant stream of visitors, reporters, and curiosity seekers who continued to arrive at their remote cabin. The stress of the situation was taking its toll on the entire family, and Clara's parents began to show signs of physical and emotional exhaustion. It was during this chaotic period that Clara began to speak of her own impending death. During her lucid moments, she would tell her family that she could see her own future and that her time on earth was drawing to a close. She spoke of death not with fear, but with a kind of peaceful acceptance that seemed strange in someone so young. Clara's predictions about her own death proved to be disturbingly accurate. She told her mother that she would die on a Tuesday morning in late May, just as the apple trees in their small orchard were beginning to bloom. She described the weather conditions, the people who would be present, and even the specific time of day when her spirit would finally separate permanently from her physical body. Mary Smith, desperate to prevent the fulfillment of her daughter's prophecy, consulted with every healer, doctor, and spiritual advisor she could find. But Clara seemed to exist beyond the reach of earthly intervention. Her episodes had become so intense and prolonged that she spent most of her time in states of consciousness that seemed to belong more to the spiritual realm than the physical world. As the predicted date approached, the Smith cabin became the site of what could only be described as a death watch. Family members, Frieste, NDS, medical observers, and reporters gathered to witness what Clara had foretold would be her final day on Earth. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation and dread, as everyone present wondered whether they were about to witness a tragic coincidence or something far more mysterious. The morning of Clara's predicted death dawned clear and warm, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of apple blossoms through the open windows of the Smith cabin. Clara had been unconscious for 3 days, lying in what appeared to be a profound coma. But as the sun rose, she suddenly opened her eyes and began to speak with a clarity and strength that amazed everyone present. For the next several hours, Clara conducted what could only be described as farewell conversations with invisible visitors. She spoke with deceased relatives, thanking them for their guidance and expressing her eagerness to join them. She had conversations with living family members and friends from distant locations, offering comfort and advice for their futures. Most remarkably, she seemed to be speaking with entities from beyond normal human experience, discussing concepts and realities that transcended earthly understanding. Her voice during these conversations took on qualities that witnesses described as otherworldly, resonating with harmonics that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her physical body. Dr. Henderson, who was present throughout Clara's final day, later wrote that he felt he was witnessing not just a death, but a transformation. Clara's physical body was clearly failing, but her consciousness seemed to be expanding, reaching into realms of existence that science had never imagined. As the morning progressed toward noon, the exact time Clara had predicted for her death, her conversations with invisible visitors became more intense and joyful. She spoke of seeing lights and colors beyond human perception, of music that existed in frequencies beyond physical hearing, and of love that transcended all earthly understanding. At precisely 11:47 a.m., Clara opened her eyes one final time and looked directly at her mother. "It's time," she whispered, her voice carrying a peace that seemed to fill the entire room. "I'm going home now. Don't be sad. This isn't an ending. It's just a different kind of beginning." With those words, Clara Smith closed her eyes and drew her final breath. But witnesses later claimed that something extraordinary happened in the moment of her death. The room filled with a warm, golden light that seemed to emanate from Clara's body itself. The temperature rose noticeably, and several people reported feeling an overwhelming sense of peace and joy that lasted for several minutes after Clara's physical death. Dr. Henderson, who had been monitoring Clara's vital signs, noted that her death was unlike any he had ever witnessed. Her heart simply stopped beating, with no struggle, no pain, and no apparent distress. It was as if her spirit had simply chosen to leave her physical body behind, moving on to whatever realm awaited her. The news of Clara Smith's death spread quickly throughout the region and beyond. Newspapers that had been following her case published lengthy obituaries that read more like accounts of mystical experiences than typical death notices. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch headline read, "Girl who saw beyond death finally makes journey to other side." But Clara's death was not the end of her story. In fact, it marked the beginning of a new chapter that would prove even more mysterious than her life had been. The Smith family, following Clara's own instructions given during her final conversations, buried her in the small cemetery behind their local church. The funeral service was attended by hundreds of people who had come from across the Midwest to pay their respects to the girl who had challenged everything they thought they knew about life, death, and human consciousness. Reverend Morrison, who conducted the service, later said that he had never experienced anything like Clara's funeral. The weather, which had been threatening rain all morning, cleared suddenly as the service began, and the cemetery was filled with an unusual warmth and golden light that seemed to come from nowhere. Birds that had been silent all morning began singing in harmonies that witnesses described as almost supernatural. But the most remarkable aspect of Clara's funeral was the sense of presence that many attendees reported feeling. Dozens of people claimed to sense Clara's spirit at the service, offering comfort and reassurance to those who mourned her passing. Some reported seeing glimpses of a young girl in white moving among the mourners, while others simply felt an overwhelming sense of peace and joy that seemed to emanate from Clara's grave. In the weeks and months following Clara's death, her grave became a pilgrimage site for people seeking healing, guidance, and proof of life beyond death. Visitors reported experiencing visions, receiving messages from deceased loved ones, and witnessing phenomena that seemed to confirm Clara's claims about the reality of spiritual existence. The local church, initially skeptical of these reports, eventually acknowledged that something unusual was happening at Clara's grave. They appointed a committee to investigate the various claims and documented dozens of apparently miraculous events that occurred in the cemetery where Clara was buried. Medical professionals who had studied Clara's case continued to debate the nature of her condition long after her death. Dr. Henderson published a detailed case study in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, concluding that Clara had suffered from a previously unknown neurological condition that somehow allowed her consciousness to operate beyond normal physical limitations. Dr. Hessler, the neurologist who had examined Clara shortly before her death, published her own analysis in which she speculated that Clara's brain had undergone some kind of evolutionary development that enabled her to access levels of consciousness normally unavailable to human beings. She suggested that Clara might represent the next stage in human cognitive evolution. But not all medical professionals were convinced by these explanations. Some continued to insist that Clara's case could be explained by conventional means, that she had suffered from epilepsy complicated by hysteria, and that the supernatural phenomena reported by witnesses were the result of mass suggestion and wishful thinking. The debate over Clara's case extended beyond medical circles into religious and philosophical communities. Spiritualists claimed that Clara's experiences proved the reality of communication with the spirit world and the survival of consciousness after death. Theosophists saw her as evidence of human potential to transcend physical limitations through spiritual development. Skeptics, however, argued that Clara's case was a tragic example of how superstition and wishful thinking could transform a sick child into a supernatural phenomenon. They pointed to the lack of truly rigorous scientific documentation and suggested that the various witnesses to Clara's abilities had been deceived by clever trickery or their own expectations. The controversy surrounding Clara's case continued throughout the 1910s and into the 1920s. Books were written analyzing her experiences from various perspectives, and her story became a standard example in discussions about the boundaries between science and the supernatural. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Clara's legacy was the way her case influenced the development of early parapsychology. Researchers who studied her story began to develop more rigorous methods for investigating claims of psychic phenomena, and Clara's case became a model for the systematic study of consciousness and its potential capabilities. The Smith family eventually left the Ozarks, unable to cope with the constant stream of visitors and curiosity seekers who continued to arrive at their cabin. They moved to a larger town where they could live anonymously, but they never spoke publicly about Clara's case again. Mary Smith lived until 1954, and those who knew her said she never recovered from the loss of her remarkable daughter. The cabin where Clara lived and died eventually fell into ruin, but the site continued to attract visitors for decades. Local residents reported strange phenomena in the area: unusual lights, unexplained sounds, and a persistent sense of presence that seemed to linger in the abandoned homestead. Modern medical professionals who have studied Clara's case using contemporary knowledge and diagnostic tools have proposed various explanations for her condition. Some suggest she suffered from a rare form of temporal lobe epilepsy that could account for her visions and apparent psychic abilities. Others propose that she may have had a form of encephalitis that affected her brain's normal functioning. Neurologists have speculated that Clara might have experienced a condition similar to savant syndrome, in which brain injury or unusual development creates extraordinary abilities in specific areas while leaving other cognitive functions intact. This could potentially explain her apparent psychic abilities as a form of heightened sensory perception or pattern recognition. Psychiatrists have suggested that Clara's experiences might have been the result of dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. This could account for her different voices and apparent conversations with invisible participants. The trauma of her physical illness might have triggered the development of alternate personalities that manifested as spiritual entities. But none of these modern explanations fully account for all the phenomena reported in Clara's case. The apparent accuracy of her predictions, her survival without food or sleep, and the physical phenomena witnessed by multiple observers remain difficult to explain using conventional medical knowledge. Some researchers have suggested that Clara's case might be better understood through the lens of quantum physics and consciousness studies. They propose that her illness might have somehow altered her brain's normal quantum processes, allowing her consciousness to access information or realities normally beyond human perception. Others have speculated that Clara might have been experiencing what some theorists call quantum consciousness, a state in which the quantum effects normally confined to the microscopic level somehow manifested in her macroscopic brain function. This theoretical framework could potentially explain how her consciousness might have transcended normal physical limitations. But these explanations remain highly speculative, and the scientific community continues to debate whether consciousness can truly exist independently of brain function or whether human awareness might have capabilities that current science doesn't recognize. Cultural anthropologists who have studied Clara's case have focused on the social and cultural factors that shaped how her story was interpreted and remembered. They note that the early 20th century was a time of tremendous change in American society, with traditional religious beliefs coming into conflict with new scientific understanding. Clara's case occurred at a time when many people were struggling to reconcile their faith with emerging scientific knowledge. Her story provided a bridge between these worldviews, suggesting that science and spirituality might not be incompatible after all. This may explain why her case resonated so strongly with people from diverse backgrounds and belief systems. The role of media coverage in shaping Clara's story has also been the subject of scholarly analysis. Researchers have noted that newspaper accounts of her case became progressively more sensationalized over time, with later reports including elements that weren't present in earlier, more sober medical documentation. This suggests that Clara's story may have evolved through the process of being retold, with each generation of storytellers adding elements that reflected their own expectations and beliefs about supernatural phenomena. The true Clara Smith may have been quite different from the mystical figure who emerged in popular accounts of her case. But even allowing for the possibility of embellishment and misinterpretation, enough credible documentation exists to suggest that Clara Smith did experience phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of human consciousness and its limitations. The question remains whether these phenomena were the result of unknown medical conditions, undiscovered human capabilities, or something truly supernatural. Today, more than a century after Clara's death, her case continues to fascinate researchers in fields ranging from neuroscience to paranormal investigation. New technologies and scientific methods have provided tools for studying consciousness and brain function that weren't available in 1913, but many of the fundamental questions raised by Clara's case remain unanswered. Modern brain imaging techniques could potentially reveal the neurological basis for conditions like Clara's, but such technology cannot be applied retroactively to historical cases. We can only analyze the documentation that exists and wonder what might have been discovered if Clara had been studied using 21st century scientific methods. The question of whether consciousness can exist independently of brain function remains one of the great unsolved mysteries in science. Clara's case provides tantalizing hints that human awareness might have capabilities that current scientific understanding doesn't recognize, but it also demonstrates how difficult it can be to distinguish between genuine phenomena and the influence of expectation, suggestion, and cultural belief. Perhaps the most important lesson from Clara Smith's story is the need for humility in the face of the unknown. Science has made tremendous progress in understanding the human body and mind, but there remain vast territories of human experience that science has barely begun to explore. Clara's case reminds us that reality might be far stranger and more complex than our current theories suggest. The story of Clara Smith also highlights the enduring human fascination with mysteries that exist at the boundaries of known experience. In every generation, there are individuals who seem to challenge conventional understanding of what it means to be human. These cases force us to confront the limitations of our knowledge and consider possibilities that might seem impossible according to current scientific paradigms. Whether Clara Smith was a sick child whose condition was misunderstood and mythologized, a rare example of undiscovered human potential, or something truly supernatural, her story continues to resonate because it touches on fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, reality, and human possibility. In the end, Clara Smith remains what she was called in life, the girl science couldn't explain. Her case stands as a reminder that despite all our advances in medical knowledge and scientific understanding, there are still mysteries in this world that defy easy explanation. Perhaps that's as it should be. Perhaps there should always be stories like Clara's to keep us humble, curious, and open to possibilities we haven't yet imagined. The legend of Clara Smith lives on in the folklore of the Missouri Ozarks, where local residents still speak of the strange girl who could see beyond the veil between life and death. Her grave remains a destination for those seeking answers to questions that science cannot yet address. And somewhere in the archives of medical journals and newspaper files, her story waits to inspire new generations of researchers who refuse to accept that anything is truly impossible. Clara Smith's legacy is not just a tale of one remarkable girl, but a challenge to all of us to keep our minds open to the vast unknowns that still surround us. In a world that often seems to have explanations for everything, Clara's story reminds us that mystery, wonder, and the unexplained are still very much a part of the human experience. And perhaps in the end, that's the most important lesson her brief but extraordinary life has to teach us.